Hi, welcome to video 8 of Function Basics in R. In this case, we're going to talk just a little bit about iteration and function inputs. So in iteration, you may want to do something multiple times. So in this, and it's going to have, we'll talk about for loops. That just means you're going to loop through. In this case, every time I is from 1 to 10, you will do something. So you'll do the stuff that's between the curly brackets. So first time through, I is going to be set to 1, and it'll do all this stuff where I is equal to 1. Then I will go to 2, and it'll go do through all this stuff where I is equal to 2. So forth until it gets to 10, and then it'll do the stuff for I equals 10. Frequently this do this stuff has something to do with I in here. So that's one way to do a for loop in R. Another is sequence along X. Now this is slightly preferable to doing this thing because if X is empty, then it just won't ever execute this. So this is another way to do that. Another thing you might want to do is for something, a letter that's in a name, and then to do a sort of a print statement. So that's another format it can take. As far as function inputs, so when you list your function inputs, the first input to your function should be the data set that you want it to operate on. This way you can use it with the pipe if you want to use it with the pipe later on. So later arguments should be the parameters that control the details of the computation. And generally, if I have parameters and not just the data, but parameters like na.rm equals true, right? I should have a default specified for those, and the default should be the most commonly used value that I have, unless there's some safety reason to do it differently. So we can look at some functions and see what the defaults are. Let's look at some of the common functions and see. So here I'm looking up the help on the log function, and I can see if I read down here, it tells me about the logarithms and so forth, and the arguments. It looks like x and the base, and if I look through here, I ought to be able to find some of the defaults. Let's see. Yeah, the base for the log is e, right? The exp of 1. So the default for the base is 1, but I guess I can use a different base, right? So I could say, let's look at the number 8. Let's make x is 8. And if we do log of x, that's going to use the base of e. But let's try log of x and set the base. Let's say base is 2. Then we find out that the log base 2 is 3. So I see that this is the second argument, but if I don't specify it, it uses the default. So this is an idea of how you want to use defaults in your functions. So you want to use the most common entry as the default. That way, if the user doesn't supply that argument, there's one supplied for them. Okay? So you could look at some of these other functions and see if you can find what are the defaults for those. So when you call a function, you don't want to put the name of the data argument. You don't want to say x equals so-and-so. But you do want to specify the names of the other parameters so you don't have to remember what order you're calling them in. So as long as you give it the names, then you don't have to put it in a certain order. Now here's names of arguments that are sort of standardized that you can use without making a descriptive argument, a descriptive name. So you want to use descriptive names unless you're using x, y, and z, which is vectors, w, which is weights, df for data frame, I and j for indices, usually rows and columns, n for a length or the number of rows, and p for the number of columns. So those are sort of standardized names that you can use without using a long descriptive name. Now your exercise for this little section that you will incorporate into your assignment for this module is to write a function that loops over each item in the input and prints it out on a new line. So you're also going to specify the default input of the integers to be the integers from 1 to 5. So if the person does not provide an input, that'll be the input that you use. Test it both with and without a user-provided input to be sure it does the right thing. And as usual, put the test results so that I can see them in your knitted document. And then come back and we'll do probably the final video in this function basics.